It began not with a statement but with a silence and absence so deliberate it sent shockwaves through the palace corridors. When Princess Anne refused to attend a scheduled royal briefing, insiders knew something had shifted. Hours later, whispers surfaced of private footage no one was supposed to see, footage that would soon force even King Charles III into an unprecedented corner. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The silence did not arrive suddenly. It had been building, quietly, almost imperceptibly, over weeks of subtle tension that few outside the inner circle could fully understand. Reports suggest that the cancelled briefing was not an ordinary engagement, but a carefully arranged internal discussion involving senior aides, legal advisors, and those entrusted with safeguarding the monarchy's most sensitive records. When Anne withdrew without explanation, it disrupted more than a schedule, it fractured the illusion of control. Palace staff, usually disciplined to the point of invisibility, were reportedly instructed to stand down, a phrase rarely used unless something had moved beyond routine containment. And in that moment, the absence of noise became deafening. Insiders whisper that this was not an isolated incident but the culmination of growing strain between Anne and Charles, a tension that had subtly surfaced in recent appearances, in measured glances, in the absence of their usual synchronized presence. Those familiar with the internal rhythms of the royal household began to note a shift, something colder, more calculated. It is said that Anne had requested access to materials long considered dormant, archives that exist not for public history, but for private reckoning. The suggestion alone was enough to unsettle seasoned aides, because such archives are rarely opened without consequence. And then came the whispers, quiet at first, almost dismissible, but persistent. Rumors that a sealed collection had been accessed. That something once deemed too sensitive for scrutiny had resurfaced. That Anne had seen it. Different interpretations of what followed describe her reaction not as emotional, but as resolute, as though what she encountered confirmed something she had long suspected but never proven. Palace administrative streams, ranging from hushed corridor exchanges to carefully managed internal briefings, began to converge around one unsettling idea. Whatever had been uncovered was not just personal, it carried institutional weight. Meanwhile, the public saw none of this. What they saw instead was a void, no clarification, no denial, no carefully worded statement. And in the world of the monarchy, silence is never empty. It is strategic, deliberate, and often more revealing than any admission. Media insiders, particularly those long attuned to the subtle signals of royal behavior, began to question the absence itself. Why no reassurance? Why no narrative control? Why allow speculation to breathe when it could have been quietly extinguished? The answer, some suggest, is that this time control was no longer absolute, because behind that silence, something irreversible was taking shape. A decision had been made not impulsively, but with the weight of legacy behind it. And as the palace held its breath, the realization began to settle in the situation was no longer about managing perception. It was about confronting something far deeper, something that could not simply be dismissed or rewritten. But what Anne had uncovered wasn't just sensitive, it was explosive, and it traced back to a moment the palace had tried to bury. Behind reinforced doors and under layers of protocol, a piece of history had been quietly locked away until now. When Princess Anne reportedly gained access to the private archive, what she found wasn't just footage, it was a narrative contradiction, one that threatened to unravel carefully maintained royal optics and expose a moment of vulnerability at the very top. What followed was not immediate chaos, but something far more unsettling, a controlled stillness that masked the weight of what had just been uncovered. Reports suggest that the footage in question had been sealed for years, categorized under restricted royal records that only a select few could ever authorize for review. It was never meant to resurface, not because it lacked importance, but because its significance was too dangerous, too complicated, too capable of shifting long-standing perceptions. And yet, somehow, it had found its way back into the present, into the hands of someone who did not flinch in the face of institutional discomfort. Insiders whisper that the footage traces back to a critical internal family dispute, one that had been quietly resolved behind closed doors, or at least, that is how it had been presented to the public. But the reality, as suggested by those familiar with the archive's contents, appears far less tidy. Different interpretations of the material describe a moment where unity fractured, where decisions were made not out of strength, but out of pressure, uncertainty, and perhaps even miscalculation. The kind of moment that cannot be easily explained without raising more questions than answers. There is also growing speculation that key details surrounding this incident were not simply overlooked, but intentionally withheld from public record. That what the world had been told at the time was only a fragment of a much larger and more complicated truth. Palace administrative streams, usually precise in their handling of historical narratives, now appear to have gaps that this footage threatens to expose. And with that exposure comes a deeper, more uncomfortable realization that the story the public believed may have been carefully curated rather than fully revealed. Even within the palace, the reaction has reportedly been one of quiet unease. Royal archivists, individuals trained to preserve history without interfering in its interpretation, are said to have expressed concern not about the footage itself, but about what its release could trigger. Because once something like this is acknowledged, it cannot simply be contained again. It invites scrutiny. It invites reinterpretation. And perhaps most dangerously, it invites doubt. But what has unsettled observers the most is not just the existence of the footage, but Anne's response to it. Described by those close to the situation as cold and decisive, her reaction was not one of shock, but of clarity. As though what she saw did not surprise her, but instead confirmed something she had long suspected. That this was not an isolated moment, but part of a larger pattern, one that had remained hidden, protected by time and silence. And once that realization takes hold, it changes everything. Because this is no longer about a single piece of footage. It is about what that footage represents: a break in the narrative, a challenge to the version of events that had been accepted for years. And as those fragments began to circulate quietly among a select inner circle, the atmosphere shifted once again, this time from uncertainty to something far more focused. And as the contents of that footage began to circulate behind closed doors, one name kept surfacing again and again. Every royal crisis eventually narrows to a single figure, and this time all roads led to the king himself. As fragments of the footage were quietly reviewed, insiders began to suggest that King Charles III wasn't just present in the scene, he was central to it. And the implications were far more damaging than anyone anticipated. At first, the idea seemed almost unthinkable. The monarchy is built on continuity, on the careful preservation of image, on the belief that those at the very top embody stability rather than uncertainty. But as reports suggest, the footage did not reinforce that image, it challenged it. Those who had access to even portions of the material describe a moment charged with tension, a highly sensitive family exchange where decisions carried weight far beyond the immediate circumstances. And within that moment, Charles was not a distant observer. He was engaged, involved, and according to various interpretations, positioned in a way that now invites uncomfortable scrutiny. Insiders whisper that what makes this situation so volatile is not just what the footage shows, but what it implies. A single decision made under pressure can echo for years when it involves the monarchy. And in this case, that decision appears to have shaped how a deeply personal conflict was handled, managed, and ultimately presented to the outside world. The problem now is that the version of events long accepted may no longer align with what the footage suggests. And once that alignment breaks, even slightly, it creates a ripple effect that is difficult to contain. Questions have begun to surface, quietly but persistently. Why was the situation handled the way it was? Were alternative paths considered, or was the outcome predetermined by forces unseen? Those familiar with the inner workings of royal protocol understand that every action is rarely isolated. It is part of a broader framework of expectation, pressure, and legacy. But that understanding does not erase accountability. If anything, it intensifies it. Because when the figure at the center is the king himself, the margin for error becomes almost non-existent. Within the palace, the response has reportedly been far from unified. Senior aides, usually aligned in their approach to crisis management, are said to be divided. Some advocate for quiet containment, for maintaining the traditional approach of minimizing exposure and allowing time to dilute the impact. Others, however, recognize that this situation may not be so easily managed. that the existence of the footage alone changes the equation, making silence less effective and potentially more damaging. And in that division, the sense of instability grows not outwardly visible, but deeply felt. Amid this tension, one shift has become increasingly difficult to ignore. Princess Anne, long regarded as one of the most steadfast figures within the institution, has begun to distance herself not dramatically, not in a way that invites immediate attention, but subtly, deliberately. Appearances that once conveyed unity now carry an undercurrent of separation. Interactions that once seemed effortless now feel measured, restrained. It is the kind of shift that only those paying close attention would notice, but once seen, it cannot be unseen. And with that shift comes a deeper concern: reputation. Not just personal reputation, but institutional credibility, because the monarchy does not exist in isolation. It exists in the perception of those who observe it, who believe in its stability, its consistency, its sense of unshakable order. If that perception begins to crack, even slightly, the consequences extend far beyond a single moment or a single decision. They begin to shape how the entire institution is viewed, questioned, and ultimately judged. The gravity of that realization is what transforms this from a private matter into something far more significant. This is no longer about what happened in the past, it is about how that past is understood in the present. And as the weight of that understanding settles in, it becomes clear that the path forward cannot simply rely on quiet adjustments or careful messaging. Something more decisive, more deliberate, is required. But Anne wasn't interested in quiet damage control, she was preparing something far more decisive. When Princess Anne moves, she doesn't hesitate, and she doesn't warn. What followed next wasn't a discussion, but a calculated maneuver insiders would later describe as the Iron Protocol, a silent, procedural strike designed to force accountability where tradition once protected silence. What made this moment so extraordinary was not just the decision itself, but the precision behind it. Reports suggest that Anne did not act impulsively, she acted with intent, drawing on decades of institutional understanding, knowing exactly where pressure would be most effective. The first signs were subtle, almost invisible to the public eye. Access to specific archival materials was quietly restricted. Internal communication channels, once fluid and unguarded among senior aides, became tightly controlled. It was as if an unseen boundary had been drawn overnight, one that signaled a shift from passive containment to active scrutiny. Insiders whisper that the Iron Protocol was never about confrontation in the traditional sense. It was about structure, about creating a framework in which questions could no longer be dismissed or deferred. Anne reportedly initiated a series of internal review procedures tied directly to royal conduct. Mechanisms rarely activated unless the matter at hand carried profound institutional implications. These were not symbolic gestures. They were procedural levers designed to compel clarity where ambiguity had once been tolerated. At the same time, a quiet alignment began to take shape behind the scenes. Senior royals and trusted advisors, individuals who understood both the weight of tradition and the necessity of adaptation, were drawn into what can only be described as a discreet alliance. There were no public declarations, no visible displays of unity, but the shift was unmistakable. Those familiar with the inner workings of the palace describe a growing sense of coordination, a shared recognition that the situation required more than careful messaging, it required decisive action. And at the center of that action was an increasing focus on past decisions involving King Charles III, not in a way that suggested immediate judgment, but in a way that demanded reevaluation. Every detail, every choice, every moment captured within that footage was now being examined through a different lens. A lens shaped not by loyalty alone, but by responsibility to the institution itself. This shift, subtle as it may have seemed, carried enormous weight, because once scrutiny begins at that level, it cannot easily be contained. Palace legal teams, usually operating in the background, were reportedly brought into the situation with unusual urgency. Their involvement signaled something significant, that this was no longer just a matter of internal concern, but one that could have broader implications. Legal frameworks, long established to protect the monarchy, were now being interpreted in ways that allowed for accountability rather than avoidance. It was a delicate balance, one that required precision, discretion, and an unwavering commitment to the integrity of the institution. As these processes unfolded, the atmosphere within the palace began to change. The silence that once defined the situation was replaced by something more controlled, more deliberate. Information was no longer being suppressed, it was being managed, shaped, and, in some cases, prepared for eventual exposure. This was not chaos. It was strategy. A transition from secrecy to controlled transparency, where every move carried intention, and every decision was part of a larger, unfolding plan. And in that shift, the true impact of Anne's actions began to take hold. This was no longer about containing a narrative, it was about redefining it. About ensuring that what had been hidden could no longer remain untouched, and that the institution itself could withstand the weight of that revelation. The Iron Protocol had done more than initiate a process, it had altered the trajectory of the crisis entirely. And as the pressure mounted, the palace found itself facing a scenario it had long avoided: public accountability. For a monarch, apology is not just rare, it is seismic. But as the situation escalated beyond containment, even King Charles III found himself with limited options. What followed was a moment few thought they would ever witness, a forced acknowledgement shaped not by tradition, but by undeniable pressure. The shift did not happen overnight, but when it came with unmistakable force. Reports suggest that the internal pressure had been building steadily, tightening like a vice around the very structure that once shielded the monarchy from direct confrontation. What began as controlled scrutiny had evolved into something far more urgent. Conversations that were once cautious became direct. Questions that had been quietly set aside were brought forward with a new sense of insistence. And at the center of it all stood Charles, no longer insulated by protocol, but drawn into a situation that demanded response. Insiders whisper that the breaking point was not a single moment, but a culmination of mounting tension. The existence of the footage, the internal reviews, the shifting alliances, all of it converged into a reality that could no longer be managed behind closed doors. There is a threshold in every institution where silence stops being protection and starts becoming liability. And by all accounts, that threshold had been crossed. For Charles, the choice was no longer between action and inaction. It was between controlled acknowledgement and the risk of uncontrolled revelation. When the decision was made, it was done with precision, but not without consequence. The acknowledgement itself, described by those familiar with its tone as measured but necessary, carried a weight that extended far beyond its words. It was not an admission framed in weakness, but it was not shielded by strength either. It existed in a space rarely occupied by the monarchy, a space where accountability was visible, where responsibility could not be entirely obscured by tradition. And that alone marked a departure from the norm. Within the royal household, the reaction was anything but uniform. Some saw the move as essential, a step towards stabilizing a situation that had grown increasingly volatile. Others viewed it with unease, concerned about the precedent it might set. Because once a monarch acknowledges pressure, even indirectly, it alters the dynamic of authority. It introduces the idea that the crown, while powerful, is not beyond influence. And that idea, once introduced, cannot easily be undone. Beyond the palace walls, the impact was immediate. Public perception, often shaped by distance and carefully curated narratives, began to shift with surprising velocity. What had once been a distant, almost untouchable institution suddenly felt more human, more vulnerable, more exposed. For some, this was a moment of regained trust, a sign that the monarchy could adapt, could respond, could evolve. For others, it raised deeper questions about what had led to this point and whether the response, however necessary, was enough. Amid all of this, one presence remained steady, almost unyielding: Princess Anne. Her role in shaping this outcome, though never publicly declared, is widely seen as pivotal. It was her insistence on process, her refusal to allow the situation to be quietly absorbed into silence, that created the conditions for this moment to occur. She did not seek the spotlight, but her influence was unmistakable. In a system built on hierarchy, she had altered the direction of events without ever appearing to challenge it directly. And yet, even as the acknowledgement was made, even as the immediate tension began to ease, there was a lingering sense that this was not an ending. Because moments like this do not simply resolve, they transform. They leave behind questions, expectations, and a new awareness that changes how everything is perceived moving forward. The monarchy had faced the moment, but in doing so, it had also stepped into unfamiliar territory. But while the apology may have closed one chapter, it opened another one that would redefine the balance of power within the monarchy. Apologies may calm the surface, but beneath, the fractures remain. In the days that followed, the palace entered a phase insiders described as controlled instability, where every interaction, every appearance, carried the weight of what had just unfolded. What made this period so unsettling was not open conflict, but the quiet recalibration happening behind closed doors. Reports suggest that the internal dynamics among senior royals began to shift almost immediately, not through dramatic confrontations, but through subtle changes in influence, access, and decision-making authority. Conversations that once flowed through familiar channels were now rerouted, filtered, and carefully measured. There was no formal declaration of change, yet those within the institution could feel it a shift in gravity, pulling power in a direction that had not been so clearly defined before. At the center of that shift stood Princess Anne. Her presence, always steady, now carried a different weight. Insiders whisper that her role in shaping the response to the crisis had elevated her position in ways that were not publicly acknowledged but widely understood. She was no longer simply a senior royal fulfilling duty. She had become a central force in guiding how the institution would navigate its most delicate challenges. Decisions that once required broader consensus were now, according to various interpretations, increasingly influenced by her perspective. Not imposed, but respected to a degree that subtly redefined the balance of authority. Meanwhile, palace aides found themselves operating under a level of caution that bordered on restraint. Every word, every briefing, every internal exchange was scrutinized with a heightened awareness of consequence. The margin for error, always narrow, had become almost non-existent. It is said that even routine communications were approached with a level of precision typically reserved for moments of crisis. Because in this environment, even the smallest misstep carried the risk of reigniting a situation that had only just been brought under control. Beyond the palace, the narrative continued to evolve. Media interpretations, once aligned with established patterns of royal coverage, began to diverge. Some framed the events as a necessary moment of accountability, a sign that the monarchy could confront its own challenges with a degree of transparency. Others viewed it as a fracture, a glimpse into internal tensions that had long been concealed. And between those interpretations, the public found itself navigating a more complex understanding of the institution, one that was no longer defined solely by tradition, but by its capacity to respond under pressure. Within this shifting landscape, the relationships between key royal figures also appeared to change, though not in ways that were immediately visible. King Charles III, while still central to the institution, now operated within a context that had subtly altered around him. Interactions that once projected unity now carried a more measured tone. Engagements that once felt effortless now seemed carefully calibrated. It was not distance in the conventional sense, but a quiet redefinition of roles, one that acknowledged what had happened without ever stating it outright. And with that redefinition came a deeper awareness of long-term implications. Reputation, once considered stable, now appeared more fluid, more responsive to moments of vulnerability. The monarchy, an institution built on continuity, was now navigating the reality that its perception could shift more quickly than previously assumed. This was not a collapse, nor was it a complete transformation. It was something more subtle, more enduring, a recognition that even the most established structures are not immune to change. The consequences of that recognition will not be measured in days or weeks, but in the gradual evolution of how the institution presents itself, how it governs internally, and how it is understood by those who observe it. Because once a moment like this occurs, it becomes part of the narrative, shaping expectations and influencing decisions long after the immediate tension has faded. And within that ongoing process, the true impact of what has unfolded will continue to reveal itself, quietly but persistently. And as the dust slowly settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. The monarchy had changed. Power within the monarchy rarely shifts overnight, but when it does, it leaves a permanent mark. What Princess Anne set into motion wasn't just a response to a crisis, it was a recalibration, a quiet rebalancing of authority that would shape the institution's future in ways still unfolding. In the aftermath of the upheaval, what began to emerge was not chaos, but structure. Reports suggest that Anne's influence, once steady and respected, had taken on a more defined and central role, one rooted not in visibility, but in trust. She had not sought to lead in the traditional sense. Yet circumstances had positioned her as a stabilizing force at a moment when stability itself had become uncertain. Insiders whisper that her approach was not about control, but about clarity, about reinforcing boundaries that had, over time, become blurred by compromise and quiet concessions. And in doing so, she reshaped how authority was understood within the institution. This shift brought with it a renewed emphasis on accountability, not as a reaction to crisis, but as a principle to be sustained moving forward. The monarchy, long associated with continuity and tradition, now found itself navigating a more structured internal framework, one where decisions were not only guided by legacy, but evaluated through a lens of responsibility. Palace administrative streams, once focused primarily on preservation, began to reflect a more deliberate balance between protection and transparency. It was a subtle transformation, but one with far-reaching implications. Because once accountability becomes embedded in the structure, it changes how every future decision is approached. At the same time, public perception began to respond to this shift in ways that were both cautious and revealing. For many, the acknowledgement of internal challenges and the visible response to them introduced a sense of realism that had often been absent from the monarchy's carefully curated image. Trust, once assumed, had been tested. And while not fully restored, it showed signs of rebuilding, shaped by the belief that the institution could confront its own complexities rather than conceal them. This was not a dramatic reversal of sentiment, but a gradual recalibration, one that reflected a more nuanced understanding of what the monarchy represents in a modern context. Within this evolving landscape, the role of King Charles III also began to shift, though not in a way that diminished his position outright. Instead, it became more defined, more carefully aligned with the changing dynamics around him. Reports suggest that his approach moving forward would be shaped by a greater awareness of the delicate balance between authority and accountability. Where once decisions may have relied heavily on tradition, there now appeared to be a growing recognition of the need for measured adaptation. It was not a loss of power, but a refinement of it, one that acknowledged the lessons of what had just transpired. Beneath these changes, there were also signals of something deeper, taking root, a more structured model of internal governance. Not formalized in a way that would be publicly declared, but evident in the way processes were being approached, decisions were being reviewed, and roles were being understood. Those familiar with the inner workings of the palace describe a quiet shift toward consistency, toward frameworks that could withstand pressure without relying solely on discretion. It is the kind of evolution that does not announce itself, but gradually becomes embedded in the fabric of the institution. And through it all, one theme began to dominate internal discussions: legacy. Not in the abstract sense, but in a tangible, immediate way. Every decision, every adjustment, every recalibration was now being measured against its long-term impact. What would this moment mean years from now? How would it shape the narrative that future generations would inherit? These were no longer distant considerations, they were central to the way the monarchy was now thinking about itself. Because what had unfolded was never just about a single piece of footage or a single moment of acknowledgement. It was about the realization that the institution, for all its history and resilience, is not immune to change, and that its strength lies not in resisting that change, but in shaping it with intention. Because in the end, this was never just about one moment, it was about what the crown represents. Some truths can be delayed, reshaped, even buried, but never erased. What began as a whisper behind palace walls had become something far greater, a defining moment that forced the monarchy to confront itself, not through ceremony, but through consequence. What lingered after the immediate tension faded was not just memory, but meaning. The footage, once hidden and nearly forgotten, had transformed into something symbolic, no longer just a record of a private moment, but a reflection of a deeper conflict between tradition and transparency. Reports suggest that within the palace, its significance extended far beyond what it contained. It became a point of reference, a reminder that even the most carefully preserved narratives are not immune to challenge. And in that realization, the institution found itself standing at a crossroads between maintaining the comfort of silence and embracing the uncertainty of truth. Insiders whisper that this moment will not be remembered solely for what it revealed, but for what it demanded. Because the monarchy, often viewed as unchanging, has always been shaped by moments of quiet evolution. And this, many believe, was one of those moments. Not dramatic in appearance, not marked by visible upheaval, but deeply transformative in its implications. It reinforced the idea that the institution is not static, but responsive, that it can absorb pressure, adapt, and emerge altered, even if those changes are not immediately visible to the outside world. At the center of that transformation stands Princess Anne, whose actions, though measured and restrained, are increasingly seen as a defense of something far larger than any individual. Her role was not to disrupt, but to protect, to ensure that the long-term integrity of the monarchy was not compromised by short-term convenience. In doing so, she reframed the situation entirely. What could have been dismissed as a contained issue became a defining test of principle. And in that test, the emphasis shifted from preservation of image to preservation of legacy. There is also a deeper reflection that continues to resonate beneath the surface. The cost of silence. In powerful institutions, silence can serve as protection, as stability, as control. But it can also carry risk, because when silence is maintained for too long, it begins to accumulate weight, and eventually, that weight demands release. What unfolded within the palace serves as a reminder that avoiding difficult truths does not eliminate them, it only delays their impact. And when that impact arrives, it often carries greater force than if it had been faced earlier. Beyond the palace walls, the interpretation of these events continues to evolve. Public perception, shaped by fragments of information and layers of speculation, is no longer fixed. It is fluid, responsive, and increasingly aware of the complexities that define the monarchy. Historians, commentators, and observers alike will revisit this moment not just for what happened, but for what it represents. A shift, a recalibration, a subtle but undeniable acknowledgement that even the most enduring institutions must occasionally confront themselves in order to endure. And within that ongoing reflection, one principle emerges with clarity: duty over personal allegiance. The idea that the crown exists not for those who hold it, but for what it stands for. That its strength lies not in avoiding challenge, but in facing it with resolve. This is not a conclusion, but a continuation, a reminder that the story of the monarchy is not written in isolated moments, but in the way those moments are understood over time. Because in the end, the crown does not belong to those who wear it, it belongs to the legacy they leave behind. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.